Chapter 12. A Debt to Pay. Mr. Keene strode directly to Mr. Hatfield and the two cubs. The angry expression on his face left no doubt as to his attitude about the fire. "I might have known something like this would occur," he began. "Boys should never be permitted to run wild in the wooded area." "Just a minute, Mr. Keene," interposed the cub leader warily. "Don't jump to a hasty conclusion. The bank property has been damaged. We happen to own the woods, you know. It was a mistake to allow your organization to use the land." "You're assuming that the Cubs started the fire, Mr. Keene." "What else should I think? They've been here almost daily having picnics and starting fires." "That isn't true, Mr. Keene," Brad interposed, losing patience. "The Cubs have been careful about fires, knowing how dry the woods are this time of year." "We've eaten cold food," Dan added. "When the fire started, not a cub was near the place, so far as I know." The two boys were righteously angry, for they felt that the bank employee was unjustified blaming the Cub organization without having made any investigation of the facts. Several of the firefighters who had overheard the remark were of the same opinion. "That's right," spoke up one of the telephone linesmen. "Fact is, if it hadn't been for these two boys, the fire never could have been stopped. The house would have been destroyed for sure, but they saw the smoke and got help before the fire was too well started." This information softened Mr. Keene somewhat. "Is the fire out?" he demanded gruffly. "Practically so," he was informed. The leaves are smoldering in a few places, but there's no danger if the area is watched for a while. "We'll be glad to do it," offered Mr. Hatfield. Mr. Keene made no reply. Abruptly leaving the group, he went to inspect the smoking, blackened patch of burned-over ground. Brad, Dan, and other cubs watched him uneasily. From his manner, it was impossible to tell whether or not he accepted their statement that the cubs had not been responsible for the fire. Their eyes red and smarting from the smoke, too tired to care much what the bank employee thought, they flung themselves onto the grass to rest. Mr. Keene presently returned. Immediately it was evident to the cubs that his anger remained with him. "What's he picked up?" Dan muttered, noticing a charred object in his hand. "Looks like a stick," Brad replied. The object proved to be a half-burned shaft of an arrow. "This may or may not have significance," Mr. Keene said coldly, addressing the group. "I picked it up in the burned area." "It looks like too large of an arrow to be one of ours," said Dan defensively. "You're not using bows and arrows here, however." "Sure," admitted Brad. "We haven't been starting fires with them, though." "Nevertheless, the arrow convinces me that the cubs have been roving through the woods at will, undoubtedly lighting matches and—" "Cubs are taught to be careful about fire," Brad broke in. "Besides, we've told you, the cubs weren't here today. Dan and I were the first to arrive. The fire may have been slow in starting. Possibly it smoldered for hours. But that's neither here nor there. The damage has been done." "We're mighty sorry, sir," Dan said. "It wasn't our fault, and we did our best to check the fire quickly." "I'm grateful to you for that," the boys. "All the same, you see my position. I'm responsible to the bank. Of course you understand that I can't permit you to continue to use this property." The cubs gazed at Mr. Keene dumbfounded. It seemed utterly impossible that he would send them away after they had worked so hard to save the castle. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dan said, "Mr. Keene, do you mean we can't finish the filming of our play here?" The bank employee dropped the charred arrow onto the grass. He stirred uneasily under the steady, almost accusing gaze of the cubs. "I know it will inconvenience you," he said flatly, "but I have to think of the bank." "Inconvenience us," Chips fairly shouted, breaking into the conversation. "If we have to go to another place, it means filming all the scenes over again." "We've already worked against a deadline," Red added angrily. "Have a heart, Mr. Keene." Sorry, boys. Is Mr. Holloway or your cub leader around? I'll have to inform them that the organization is not to come out here again." Both Mr. Hatfield and Mr. Holloway had gone to one of the cars where equipment was being packed. Seeing the two men, Mr. Keene would have started off to intercept them, had not Brad stopped him. "Just a minute, Mr. Keene," he said quietly. "I can't feel that you're being fair. The Cubs have been as careful as they know how to be in using this property. We've cleaned up the brush and kept all of our promises." "I'm not blaming anyone," Mr. Keene replied, ill at ease. "Boys will be boys. I'm not saying the fire was started on purpose, but you see my position. I'm responsible to the bank. If you feel we caused the damage, let us pay for it," Dan spoke up suddenly. "Just give us a chance to finish our play here." The offer seemed to strike a responsive chord with the bank employee. He paused a moment to consider. "Sure," urged Chips. "The Cubs have money we were saving for costumes and scenery. We could use some of that to pay for the damage." "Well, I hardly know what to say," Mr. Keene hesitated. "No buildings were destroyed," Brad said quickly. "Only a few shrubs." "You boys did work hard to put out the fire once it started," the bank man admitted. "I suppose an arrangement could be made for you to pay for the damage." "Then you'll allow us to finish our play here?" Red demanded. "Well, if you agree to pay, I suppose I might let you stay on for a week or two, but no longer." "How much will we owe you?" Brad asked. He knew that the shrub which had burned were not rare or valuable ones. Actually, he thought that the fire had done very little damage. Although the blackened area was ugly and disfiguring, new growth would cover it. $25 should cover it, Mr. Keene said after a little thought. Now to him that amount seemed comparatively small. To the Cubs it represented a huge sum. To meet the debt, they would be required to pull every cent they had earned for costumes and perhaps dip into the organization's treasury as well. Seeing the look of consternation upon the faces of the boys, Mr. Keene amended his calculation. "Well, I'll be easy on you," he said. "Make it $20. However, the sum must be paid to the bank no later than tomorrow." Brad turned to the Cubs of Den 2. "How about it, fellas?" he asked. "Can we do it?" "We'll have to," decided Dan grimly. "I have $3 and a half saved for my costume. I'll toss that into the kitty." "How about the Cubs of Den 1? Brad asked Ross. "Will they help too?" "You'll have to ask them," he replied. "I know I can kick in. I've already used up all my paper route money to buy a costume." "I thought Mrs. Holloway was making it for you." "I decided to buy it instead," Ross answered. "No homemade job for me." With the exception of Ross, all the Cubs who were present agreed to the plan. Having pledged themselves then and there, they sought Mr. Hatfield to tell him of their decision. "If that's what you want to do, it's all right with me," he agreed. "The Cubs always pay their debt. If the bank feels we're responsible for the damage, then we'll pay whatever they ask." "Have someone bring the money to the bank tomorrow," Mr. Keene said. "I don't want to be hard on the boys, but maybe having to spend their own cash will teach them to be more careful." No one replied. Decidedly uncomfortable, the bank man said goodbye and drove away. After he had gone, however, the Cubs had a great deal to say. "He doesn't want to be too hard." "Oh, no," Midge mimicked. "We worked mighty hard for that money. And now it all goes to the bank and we didn't do a thing except cut their old brush." Red stormed. "It makes me sick." "We don't have to do it," Brad reminded the Cubs. "For that matter, we can give up the play." This the Cubs were unwilling to do. "If old Killjoy Kane says we owe him $20, let's pay it," Dan proposed grimly. "We'll have to dig up every penny we save for our costumes. That means making out with any old material we can lay our hands on. Time's too short to earn more money now. Fat chance we'll have a chance of winning the grand prize without decent costumes or scenery," Chip said gloomily. "We'll look like a band of tattered beggars." All except Ross, said Red, fastening his gaze upon the Den 1 boy. He'll have a perfectly super costume. Maybe after all, we should award him the star part. Da-doo-da-doo.